Great. Well, I want to welcome everyone back. So, we're going to have an opportunity to just reflect on the themes that we heard during this conversation. Johns and I will sort of reflect on some of the themes and patterns from the conversation. And then we already have some incredible questions in our queue. So, feel free to keep putting your questions in the chat, and we will be taking them as we go along. So I thought maybe I would start. I had the opportunity of being able to sort of witness this incredible conversation between the two of you and had just some of my own reflections, and then would love to sort of hear from both of you as well. So one of the things I observed you both doing was starting off not with what was hard, but with what you both had in common, what drew you to come to the table, and also really a lot of commonality in terms of a shared vision of a beloved society where we all belong, at caring about people, this deep commitment to people, and caring about our democracy. And so there was this pointing of the gaze towards this transformative future that I think both of you acknowledged we aren't fully there yet, but we want to strive towards that. And that being a really important foundation for being able to start off this conversation. And it was incredible to hear both of you sharing your early experiences. And I think that is also something that is so valuable to really see how our own relationships with our roots, the ways that we make meaning of these early experiences, our childhoods, where we grew up, what's underlying that, and how that shapes our lives. I think that in and of itself just sparks open a sense of humanity. When we kind of imagine the two of you as children navigating your lives, there's automatically a level of openness and compassion. I think that can start to open up there. And it frankly lets us see the complexity and the humanity as you've gone from those experiences to navigate the lives that you've then created and built for yourselves. Of course, the power of relationships and the ways in which the relationships that each of you have held and built, the dilemmas that you've each gone through as sort of you've shaped and moved things together, it allows us to sort of see how the more complex and different our networks are, the more that growth and learning can start to open up for us. Like I'm thinking in particular, John Wood, when you were describing sort of that transition into being part of a strong military culture, being part of a strong kind of religious culture, and just sort of hearing how that started to really influence and shape a lot of the ways in which you were thinking and kind of making meaning of things. And then I did really appreciate also at the end, John Powell, when you shared too, just the importance of sort of blowing open our notions of our American exceptionalism and sort of this Christian American centered focus. And I'm speaking also as someone who is a child of immigrants. I grew up actually speaking Tamil myself, so it was really cool to hear you say that. I didn't grow up Christian. And so in a lot of ways, even hearing and experiencing so much language from the Bible, I immediately felt like, wow, I can't connect to this. And that was just a really interesting experience as well, being someone who's also deeply spiritual. So just wanted to sort of zoom out and sort of share what I saw and heard, and would love to hear from both of you as well, sort of what were some of the themes and what sparked for you in having the conversation.
Well, for me, I'll just say briefly that it's always interesting to speak with somebody with whom you feel like you have a great deal in common, who has a life story that may wind up pointing in a similar direction, but goes through like the complete like other side of the road in terms of arriving at certain places. And of course, as I said, I mean, I relate deeply to sort of the religious skepticism that you expressed as being a part of your sort of awakening early in life, and the contrast in your journey and mine, with the possibility for us to still sort of come to a place wherein I think on a sort of on a fundamentally sort of spiritual level, we're motivated to see things to come to very different conclusions from very similar sorts of moral imperatives, if that makes sense, is striking to me. But it points to the common humanity, even as the circumstances may differ, I think.
Yeah, this is a great start of a conversation, and John and I talked a little bit off mic about working together, exploring that, and which I take quite seriously. And sort of interesting. I mean, my father recently died, and people who know me know that I talk about my mother and my father and my family a lot. My daughter just did a session here at the conference. Um, and so that rupture with my family was really profound. And we healed it. I felt like my father was the embodiment of all the things that's best in all the religions. He was so loving, so caring. And I felt particularly blessed to have him as a father. But they struggled with me. I remember one time I came back from India and having spent time with Goenka, who's a great Buddhist teacher. And my mother saying, I don't get it. You know, like, why do you keep studying these funny religions and going to these funny places? Why can't you just stay home like normal people? And two things. I gave her a book about the story of Buddha. And my mother was not intellectual. And her response was, he sounds like an interesting person, but I don't understand why he didn't accept Jesus. Not realizing that he lived 500 years before Jesus. And so I think it's really important to sort of have this expansive view. I mean, we're coming hopefully out of a pandemic, COVID, that shows us how deeply interconnected we are. We are grappling with things like climate change and Earth heating up. And so I think for me, the question that I grappled when I was 11 years old, what's going to happen to the Chinese, I would actually invert that a little bit now and say, what's going to happen to Americans? What's going to happen to all of us? What's going to happen to the Earth? And I think John has said in some of his work that one of the best ways to connect with people is through stories. But I think we have to get all of our stories, you know, not just the American story, not just the Indian story, not just the Chinese story, not just the African story, not just the Native American story. How do we get those stories and look for the deep resonance in those stories? And part of that, I think, happens when we have the immediacy of having contact with each other, of actually seeing someone, of looking in someone's eyes. One of the earlier panels talked about one of the dangers of social media is that we don't have physical contact anymore. We have these short messages. We're not seeing, listening to, smelling people. So I think that there's the imperative of actually building a world where the beloved community is global and it's made up of different kinds of people, but also really a reverence for life. And I think the alternative is scary. If we refuse to see someone, if we write someone off because they have a different perspective, a different political party, a different religion, a different way of eating, a different way of loving. I think consistently the world is saying that doesn't work anymore. And it's not easy, but it's wonderful to actually meet with, come in contact. And it doesn't mean giving up your own beliefs, but it's making space to actually engage with other people as well.
I do agree with all of that. If it's possible, I do want to say something on the subject of sort of bridging within a nation and then bridging as a global project. I don't think that there's any contradiction between the two. There is a way in which, you know, my work has been American-centric simply because it is sort of my immediate context. And I would say that, you know, there is a difference in mending wounds that exist between people, between sort of let's say a familial context, right? Let's say that, you know, you have a son who's abused by a father or a grandparent. You have a family history that is located within a given place and time and a certain family structure. You know, there is a story that surrounds the relationship that exists within a family that's going to be different than the story that exists between, you know, a family in one block and the family on the other side of town. And so I think that the particularities of context do matter in the context of nation and the relationships between individual groups. But I would say that the principles undergirding, bridging and the healing and the development of community across whatever the boundaries are very much universal. Agape love has to be universal. If it's not transcendent. So, there's room to be mindful of the particular context, but ultimately the tools are the same, I believe.
No, just to add.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just quickly. So I think we are in different places, and I don't mean John and I, but some of us have a life that's organized around our neighborhood. Some of us have a life that's organized around our city. Some of us have a life, and one of the benefits of being at the Institute is that we have 6 or 7 staff people in Europe. We have programs in Cuba. We have connections with Asia. So this is not just abstract for us. We actually are dealing with people. And so in a sense, the family becomes smaller and smaller. One of the hardest things about the pandemic, the people in Europe is like, we don't get to see you. We were literally moving to a place where we have a conference every 2 years in the United States. In the off year, we'd have it someplace else in the world. And I think building up, and I think the changes in the internet, the changes in travel, maybe it'll switch, but the world is getting smaller and smaller. So on one hand, I agree with John, but also feel like for a lot of us, we have families all over the world. Not all my family is here. I have family literally in Ghana. Literally, my godson is from China. I have a niece who's born in China. So the world has really gotten small. It's only going to get smaller. But there is some immediacy. So some people will spend most of their life, like I said, in neighborhoods. But I think it's important for those of us, especially in leadership position, whatever that means, to build those larger bridges, to build those longer bridges, to help model how we do that. Because a lot of what people get, especially who won't know people from India directly, who won't know Muslims directly, what they get is from the news, and what they get is from leaders and the stories we tell. So I think we have to be mindful of constantly building bridges in a real way for all people.
I want to pick up on one of the things that you just left off with just now, John Wood Jr., because it's actually one of the questions that surfaced from the audience. One of the speakers used the term ethics of bridging. What are those ethics, which implies principles and covenants? So I actually have an answer to this as well, but I don't know which one of you actually used that phrase, but feel free to jump in with that. And then I'd love to share my thoughts as well.
Well, I think about it a lot. I'm almost inclined to say I want to hear your thoughts first, but if you, as a moderator, you get to decide.
Yeah, I can share first. And so this is actually something that for the new Pluralist Collaborative, and this is actually what we've been able to use to draw together such a diverse group of people, including the two of you, across so much difference, is what do we actually share in common, and what is our notion of what it means to behave pluralistically, which is essentially this idea of honoring human dignity, that is something that cannot, without question, like that cannot be undermined. Taking responsibility for repair, widening the circle, which is, very much connected to the ways that you frame things as well, John. Finding strength in difference and striving for greater sum. So really getting beyond sort of a zero-sum game. And that we consider these to sort of be guiding principles to being able to start to embody within ourselves, sort of in our own processing of experience and why we are doing the things we are doing interpersonally, the ways in which our organizations function, and how we actually start to build with others. And that it's actually important to really name those things. Also, I know that there's a number of questions that have surfaced around, folks who are far off on long bridges who potentially have been quite violent. And, there's quite a high degree of lack of safety, personal safety, all of that. And I think actually being able to describe for ourselves, what does it mean to actually build bridges with people? How do we know that someone is in good faith actually with us in this sort of building and shaping together? So I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, John.
So I think this is really important and complicated. But let me start again from, yes, there's a risk in building bridges. There's a risk, as Adrienne Reed Brown talks about, in terms of being vulnerable. Being vulnerable basically means someone can hurt you. But I also want to remind us, not building bridges has its vulnerability. Not building bridges has its risk. It's not like if we stay away from each other, if there is such a thing, we would be safe. That's not possible. It's not possible to stay away from each other. And, maybe the most extreme example in recent was COVID-19. It's like, okay, stay away from everybody. Put down all the planes. People stay at home. Didn't matter. The virus in a minute was all around the globe. So the possibility that we can stay away from each other. I mean, there are a number of speakers today who talked about Pat from Native American, talked about the deep, deep interconnection. That's already there. It's already there. So this notion that somehow I can hunker down and just be by myself, I think it's not real. Now, how do we have the right kind of relationship? What Judith Butler talked about in my talk with her earlier is very different questions. And certainly you don't want to, we talk about people can engage where there's safety, people can engage where there's risk and generative and stretch, and then there's panic, where people are actually attacking each other and people. So we don't want to stay in that third area where people are panicked, but neither do we want to try to say, we're not asking people to come take a nap. The world is demanding something of us. And each person has to decide for themselves. Loretta, in an earlier conversation, as a rape victim, she talked about going to prison to talk to rapists. And one of the questions she got following up was, well, first, don't you have to heal your own trauma before you can help others? And basically she said, no, that's not for her. That she suggested that it's the reaching out to others that actually allows for the healing. So sometimes there's a tendency to postpone the engagement. First we have to do this, and first we have to do that. And there are guardrails, there are norms, there are ethics, but we have to decide what they are. And we see these wonderful examples of people who risk a lot to bridge, and the people who are not willing to risk. So I'm hoping that more of us will actually be willing to take the risk, because we realize the risk of not bridging is devastating.
So powerful to hear you sharing that, John, because, I think about also just being from a worldview perspective, a spiritual orientation that doesn't so much see things in sort of good and evil kind of binaries. Like I come from a tradition that is able to see paradox and hold paradox pretty easily. And this idea of, we're talking about dilemmas here. There's no hard and fast set of rules. It's highly contextualized. It's how do I feel in this moment in being able to grapple with this? And I think a lot of time our instinct is to want to say, these are the static rules. And if you break these rules, then ... But I think to that point, and that beautiful illustration of the woman you described, she knows for herself what it is that how far she can go, how far she's willing to go. And I think for myself, having grown up, yes, as a woman of color, but also having grown up with a lot of really loving family childhood, a loving home where I didn't experience a lot of trauma. There are ways in which I can stretch myself and put myself into relationships that can be sometimes upsetting or something, but I have sort of a resilience built in within me because I've had that privilege of having grown up with that much love and that much stability. And that is not the same for everyone. And I think the idea that we would almost have the same rules for how each of us navigates and chooses to form bridges, it's almost like we're flattening the very notion of bridging itself by doing that.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that I think that the way this shakes out is that we want collectively to move towards a society in which we truly do recognize and highlight the need for crossing the long bridge, while also understanding that everybody is not in the same place on the bridge, right? I think that context matters. Your own individual psychological and emotional context matters. And, to the point of what's been said here, there is risk, there is vulnerability in engaging with others in this way. I think that it may be fair to say that as a part of our growth as human beings, if we are not seeking to strive out a little bit further on the bridge, as life goes on, we may be missing the opportunity to grow as we might. But we do need to have tenderness and appreciation for our limits in the moment. And for myself, if I'm fairly eager in crossing the bridge as far out as I can, it's in part, just sort of as you said, Uma, in recognition of the fact that I do have a certain sort of context and privilege in my upbringing and in my circumstances, which kind of gives me the wherewithal to do that. Everybody's not going to be able to go the same length in reaching out, but we can perhaps all go further tomorrow than we did yesterday if we decide within ourselves that it is worth ultimately setting the intention to do so. And as a society, we can collectively uplift the need for that, all again recognizing the fact that we are in different starting points with respect to this project. And that is completely okay. We do what we can do as we can do it, and we grow the capacity to do more within ourselves over time.
If I could just add one thing to Uma, I think that's exactly right. I think we can also create a situation and space and capacity to help people mitigate risk. We did an early panel with funders, for example. We talked about funders engaging with community groups. Well, the things that funders can do to make the risk of engaging, authentic engagement, less risky. So if you have a funder and you give them some honest feedback, criticism, and you're waiting for a grant to come through, maybe I'm not going to say very much. And so we can create structures and resources so that we can mitigate the risk. There's been studies, for example, showing that in terms of entrepreneurs, people of color, Blacks in particular, are not as risk takers as their white counterparts. It turns out that has almost nothing to do with race. It has to do you have a cushion? If you have a cushion, I'm willing to climb up a mountain that if I fall, there's a cushion to break my fall. But if you climb up a mountain and if you fall, that's it. You're going to have a very different calculation. So the things we can do to actually mitigate the risk as we ask people to take risks. And then we have talked about short bridges, medium bridges, and long bridges. So not everyone's ready for a long bridge. Some people might be ready for a shorter bridge.
I want to go back to a comment you had made earlier just now, John, around the risk of not bridging. Because I think in a lot of ways, this can start to feel like, if you want to, let's do it. But I think that there is actually a level of, we got to turn the heat up a little bit. Some of the questions that I'm seeing here have to do with, understanding that while we want to be able to treat people with respect and not shame them, I don't understand how bridge building will effectively set back a growing fascist movement, which demonstrates little interest in connecting to others and has no qualms about violence. If we just focus on connecting, aren't we missing the dangers of this movement? And I think this question really kind of helped represent, it really does represent, I think, a certain feeling of limitation of this way of thinking and moving in the world. It's like, we've got this urgent crisis. How could this sort of soft stuff way of approaching things have anything to do with that?
Right. I have something I'd love to say in
Sure.
response to that. And I think I can say it fairly quickly. But, if you go all the way back to slavery and its origins and this original sort of relationship that existed between white indentured servants and Black slaves who found common cause for a brief period of time, asserting their own rights and their own dignity and shared interests. Before the powers that be cleaved that relationship in an effort to exert control through division, you'll find that it is not so much that malicious movements in American life spring organically from a soil of contempt and hatred and are therefore unavailable to relationship. Rather, it's very much the case that relationship and connection has been taken from people. They have been isolated and punished and pushed. And so they seek their own sort of satiation through contempt and fear and bitterness, which means, and disconnection, which means that relationship is the answer. It's the antidote to the spiritual void that may motivate, some of the movements that we're concerned about. And I don't say that to characterize, in my vantage point, necessarily all Trump supporters in general with this brush. My father's a Trump supporter. I have Trump supporters, in my family, black and white, et cetera, et cetera. But just to get to the principle that's being sort of pointed to here, if we think that engaging the humanity of people who are lost in inhumanity is capitulation to inhumanity, all we will do is retreat to a posture that allows that inhumanity to fester and to grow more and more and more, because there won't be any effective outreach available to pull people out of that consciousness and into a higher one. We've got to repair some of the original wounds that have set in here that puts people in the position of wanting to lash out in pain and anger and frustration in the first place. It's not to say that accountability doesn't matter. Accountability does matter, and we don't want to abandon that either. But I think that that's a lot of what you saw on January 6th. I think that's a lot of what we've seen in violent sort of populist upheavals and moments in American life. People are isolated. They feel condemned by society. They feel like they are the out group, and they flock to those who tell them that they are better than others. They flock to those who say, I will protect you, I will fight for you, and I will validate your feelings of anger, your feelings of contempt and outrage. There's got to be a counter force that sows a different seed in the mindsets of people, broadly speaking, and in this country certainly. And so I wouldn't lose confidence in the idea that soul force has power in transforming the conscience and the behavior of people who are lost in hatred. I think history has proven over and over again that love has that power.
So yeah, it's an important question for a lot of reasons, and I agree with what John just said. It's not soft and fuzzy in the sense that it's lacking power, and it's not going to do everything. Not every situation is a bridging situation, but we too quickly move away from it. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples, and some of you may have heard this before. But when Nelson Mandela was head of the ANC and fighting South Africa, and I lived in Africa when that was going on, and he met with the general of the South African army who believed that blacks were monkeys and not fully human, and that whites could win. Nelson Mandela met with him at Nelson Mandela's house. Nelson Mandela served this guy tea. He sat on a couch next to him, not across from him, next to him, which made this general very uncomfortable. And then when they started the multi-hour conversation, Nelson Mandela engaged the conversation through the language of Afrikaans, through the general's language. Nelson Mandela knew what he was doing. He was bridging. He was what Robert Sapolsky calls, he was acknowledging the general's sacred symbols. Afrikaans was the language of the oppressor. Nelson Mandela was reaching, now he was bridging. Now, he still had an army. Nelson Mandela still had guns. He still had freedom fighters. He hadn't given up any of his power. And so we have to be more sophisticated about this. It's not either or. It's not do we bridge or do we hold people accountable. It's not do we bridge or do we challenge power. We do both. We are much more complicated than that. And there are many, many, many examples of that. But if we take all of the guardrails off and basically say the other side is not human, they're not people, they don't belong, then we are capable of doing not only terrible things to them, but terrible things to ourselves. Yes, power is important. And if you look at my writing, I write about power and bridging. It's not a simple thing, but we are so prone to break right now. And not just with the people that we consider far on the bridge, we're willing to break with our families, break with our friends, break with our allies. We had a whole session on call out and cancel culture. And if we keep doing that, we're not building power, we're fracturing power. I got grief for writing an article about addressing Asian American hate. Some people are saying, why are you focused on Asian Americans? It's not their time, it's our time. So we have to be very careful. The breaking that's happening in the world, the polarization, the toxic polarization is contagious and literally toxic. And we have to have an antidote for it. It doesn't mean necessarily that we don't care about power, accountability, whatever. But we have to hold on to each other's humanity. If we don't do that, we're not doing anything.
You actually answered one of the questions that had been here right now about reconciling power and the importance of bridging. I'm wondering, there's another question that I'm seeing here. Even as a white woman, it feels to me that in bridging, people with marginalized identities are being asked to still go the extra mile to continue to see the humanity in those involved in their oppression, as they have been expected to do for far too long. Could you talk more about this and more concretely address the power, privilege, oppression dynamics in the bridging process?
Sure. Well, I think that there's a Martin Luther King Jr. faced very similar observations during the nonviolent movement. And he was quick to acknowledge the starting inequity, if you will, that faced those who sought change through means of nonviolence, because he was actively asking people to love their enemies, not just people who had problematic worldviews, but people who were literally visiting violence upon them, or in a literal, tangible sort of way. What Dr. King said, though, was that in loving your enemies, right? Because this is, from my vantage point, this is not seeing the humanity in your opposition. If it can come from a place in which we are able to cultivate an internal sort of belief in the idea that our opponents, if you will, have a humanity to be recognized, it ought to be ultimately an empowering sort of experience. King said that in loving your opposition, you accomplish two things. One, you're able to more effectively speak to the conscience of your opponent. You're more effectively able to move their thinking and therefore impact their behavior. And so even if it is emotional labor, and it is ultimately for a cause and with an outcome that justifies the exertion. But even if you fail in that effort, at least in the short-term process of the space of a single conversation, you nevertheless, in coming to be able to love your enemy, free yourself from the shackle of fear and anxiety and possibly hatred and contempt. So there ought to be an internal liberation that comes from the act of exercising an internal dialogue of goodwill towards the other party, even alongside its practical applications. And so, I think that there is an inner work that is done that corresponds to our capacity to effectively set the stage for bridge building through goodwill, which answers this question. I think that the difficulty comes in having that conversation internally, moving to the point of being able to see that humanity. But make no mistake, if you're engaged in that internal work, in that internal project, you're not even primarily doing it for them. You're doing it for yourself, because it does begin with an internal and a personal liberation. And that's what I think allows us to ultimately be able to liberate the conscience of someone else.
So again, these are great questions. Complicated, and there's some underlying assumptions. So in the 90s, there was a phrase that's going around that's basically saying Black people or people of color could not be racist because racism meant discrimination plus power or prejudice plus power, and Black people didn't have any power. And that's fundamentally wrong. The assumption that because we've been marginalized, because we've been at times enslaved, that we don't have power is wrong. We do have power. And while it may be gracious to excuse us, I don't want to. I don't want to excuse Black people from being fully human, and in that fully human space, having the capacity to actually show empathy and engage with the other. Again, you may decide not to do it. And even when we talk about white people, the person who asked the question said, as a white woman. So I work a lot with SEIU. I don't think they would mind me saying that. I know some of them are at this conference. Mary Kay and Jerry Hudson are both friends of mine. And they will tell you a good part of their constituents, 35%, maybe more, are white people. A lot of them are Trump supporters. And they talk about trying to get those people, those white people, to understand the pain of Black Americans, the pain of Latinx or Latino Americans. And I say to them, what about the pain that they're experiencing as well? If you have a white suburban nurse, single parent with 3 kids, I can tell you without knowing anything else about her, she is struggling. If she was not struggling, she wouldn't be part of your union. So we talk about white people, we have in mind the elites, the Jeff Bezos and the Bill Gates, but the people in your union, and this is the point that John made earlier, they're struggling. Can we see their pain too? And it's not to create false equivalence. But Bob Marley said, every man thinks his burden is the heaviest. And part of this is saying, can I hear your story? Not to displace my own story, but can I hear your stories, your struggle? And again, some people will say, no, we can't do that. But it's not that because you're a white woman, it's not saying you don't have struggles. And we're talking about not just individual interaction, we're talking about these struggles being weaponized by the elites for them to actually gain more power. So I don't think this is not saying, people with power get a pass. No, not at all. And there's more I could say. And all I'll say at this point is that if you look at othering and people's experience of othering in the country, the whole country's feeling othered. One of the things of living in a broken container or a cracked container, which is what we're doing now, our institutions are failing us, everybody feels othered. Everybody feels othered. Now, we may say they don't have a right to feel othered, but they do. And it's not saying we should excuse people's bad behavior, but we should also acknowledge people's humanity and their suffering. Uma, I don't want to go on too much into the biblical thing, but the idea of the Good Samaritan, right? Where there's a person on the side of the road who's suffering, and 2 people come along, a priest and another person, and they say, I'm not going to help this person because what would happen to me if I stopped and helped this stranger on the side of the road? And the Good Samaritan comes along and stops. And people say, weren't you afraid of what would happen to you stopping to help a stranger on the road? And the Good Samaritan's response is, I was more afraid of what would happen to me if I did not stop. If I did not see that person's humanity. Is there a risk? Yeah, there's a risk, but there's a risk of not stopping as well. And so from my perspective, these are not just tactical things. And the last thing I'll say on this, the research shows that in terms of moving someone, in terms of influencing someone, seeing someone and bridging is more than 100 times more effective than traditional persuasion. More than 100 times effective. Now, I hesitate to say that because some people say, okay, tactically, then we got to bridge. But I think bridging at a deep level is about a spiritual grounding. It's not just a tactic. But if you just want to be effective, it still turns out it's more effective than the traditional things we do in terms of trying to persuade people.
Beautiful. What a beautiful note to end on. I love how you managed to bring in both data and an inspiring kind of story and moral kind of spiritual core to all of this. So just wanted to thank you both for being in this incredible conversation. I know that there were a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but my hope is that this is just the beginning of this conversation for ourselves and within our communities. So thank you
So
both.
I want to thank you and encourage as many of you as are listening who are inclined, become bridgers and ambassadors. And there's skills you can learn to become better at bridging ambassadors, but lean into that if it's comfortable or a little uncomfortable.
Thank you.